Jake Monroe, a rookie cop driven by integrity, enters his new job ready to serve. But when he uncovers troubling behavior from his seasoned partner, he's forced to make a choice: stay silent or risk everything to stand up for what's right. As he faces intense backlash and personal sacrifices, Jake's courage could bring real change or end his career. Will his stand for justice prevail? Stick around to find out. And before we dive in, subscribe for more stories of resilience and comment below. Would you risk it all for what's right? Let's get started. Jake Monroe's hand rested on the leather steering wheel of his old blue Chevy, his knuckles whitening with a mix of nerves and excitement. He sat in the parking lot of the 44th Precinct, the engine idling as he took a moment to calm his racing heart. Today marked his first day as a rookie officer, a title that both thrilled and terrified him. His father's old badge, handed down to him at the academy graduation, was tucked safely in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the values he intended to uphold. The memories of his late father came flooding back, the stories of honor, courage, and the endless reminders that being a cop was more than just a job. "Jake, you wear that badge for everyone, not just yourself," his father would say, his eyes intense, filled with the same conviction that now stirred within Jake. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the car door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the precinct. The building was massive and intimidating, a labyrinth of buzzing energy and bustling officers. Jake's academy training had prepared him for the technical aspects of the job, but he quickly realized that standing in the precinct's corridors, face to face with seasoned officers who exuded authority and experience, was a different beast entirely. After a brief orientation, Jake was assigned to his partner, Sergeant Hank Barrett. He'd heard the name before. Hank was well known in the precinct for his years on the force and his reputation as a tough but fair cop. Jake hoped Hank would be someone he could look up to, a mentor who would help him navigate the nuances of policing. As he approached Hank in the break room, Jake felt a surge of anticipation mixed with nervousness. Hank was in his late 40s, his face etched with lines that spoke of years on the job, each wrinkle a story of duty and survival. "Officer Monroe, right?" Hank's voice was gruff as he extended a hand. "I'm Hank Barrett." Jake straightened up, gripping Hank's hand firmly. "Yes, sir. I'm looking forward to learning from you." Hank's gaze held steady, assessing. "Good. I don't like rookies who think they know it all," he replied. "You keep your head down, follow my lead, and maybe you'll make it in this line of work." Jake nodded, determined to earn Hank's respect. But there was a hint of something in Hank's tone, an edge that made Jake wonder just what kind of lessons he was about to learn. Later that morning, Jake found himself in a packed briefing room for a precinct-wide meeting called by Captain Miles Davenport. The new captain had arrived just weeks before Jake's own start date, bringing a wave of changes that had the precinct talking. Captain Davenport was in his early 40s, tall with a commanding presence, softened by a calm, even tone. His eyes scanned the room as he introduced himself, and Jake noticed the focused way Davenport held the attention of every officer in the room. "Thank you all for your service," Davenport began. "I know there have been a lot of changes around here lately, and I'm aware that some of these changes aren't easy to adjust to." He paused, letting the words settle, and Jake felt a ripple of tension around him. Officers murmured quietly, and he could see Hank sitting with his arms crossed, an expression of irritation clear on his face. "We're here to serve this community," Davenport continued. "That means holding ourselves to a standard that reflects the respect, dignity, and integrity our job requires. We're implementing new protocols, including body cameras, mandatory bias training, and an emphasis on community policing. I expect all of you to embrace these changes with professionalism and dedication." As the meeting wrapped up, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. Captain Davenport's words reminded him of the values his father had instilled in him. But Hank's barely hidden scowl suggested that not everyone shared the captain's enthusiasm. "More training," Hank muttered as they left the room. "Because apparently we don't know how to do our jobs." Jake glanced at his partner, unsure of how to respond. He'd only just met Hank, but it was clear they had differing views on the role of the police in the community. Still, he held his tongue, sensing that voicing his opinion too soon might only add to the already tense relationship. Their first patrol together was quiet, with Hank behind the wheel and Jake beside him, observing the rhythms of the city. As they cruised through the neighborhoods, Hank shared his view of policing in a blunt, no-nonsense manner. "You'll learn pretty quickly that out here, it's not always about the rules," Hank said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Sometimes it's about keeping control. You can't just go by the book every time." Jake nodded but felt a pang of unease. He didn't want to seem like an idealistic rookie, but he believed in the value of following procedures. He tried to think of how to respond diplomatically. "I get that things can get complicated out here, Sergeant," Jake said carefully, "but I also think it's important to be fair." Hank chuckled, shaking his head. "You'll see, kid. Fairness doesn't mean much when you're dealing with people who don't play by the rules." They drove in silence for a while, and Jake focused on taking in the sights and sounds of the city. The buildings blurred past, each one hiding stories he'd never know. He wondered what he'd learned from Hank and what kind of officer he'd become in his time at the precinct. A few days later, they were patrolling a neighborhood on the east side when Hank's attention was drawn to a sleek car driven by a black man in his 30s. The driver, who Jake would later learn was Derek Thompson, obeyed every traffic law, stopping at a light and signaling each turn. But Hank's gaze lingered. "Let's check this guy out," Hank said, reaching for the switch to activate their lights. Jake blinked, thrown by the sudden decision. "Is there a reason, sir? He hasn't done anything wrong." Hank shot him a glare. "We're out here to keep the streets safe. If I say it's worth a look, it's worth a look." The lights flashed, and Derek Thompson pulled over smoothly. Jake felt a wave of discomfort as they approached the car, the quiet tension in the air making him question his role in the stop. Derek lowered his window, looking between the two officers with wary calm. "Is there a problem, officers?" "License and registration," Hank demanded, his voice flat. Derek handed over the documents without complaint, though Jake noted a hint of irritation in his expression. As Hank reviewed the paperwork, he began asking questions that made Jake uneasy. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Hank asked, his tone carrying an edge. Derek raised an eyebrow but answered evenly. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Hank leaned in closer. "Nice car you've got here. How'd you manage that?" A tense silence filled the air as Derek kept his composure. "I work hard, just like anyone else," he replied. The exchange stirred something in Jake, an uncomfortable awareness of the assumptions Hank seemed to be making. Jake knew he was just beginning his career, but he also knew that this approach didn't align with the kind of officer he wanted to be. When they finally let Derek go, Jake felt a gnawing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stop had been unnecessary, a vague pretense that left a sour taste in his mouth. Over the following days, Jake found himself replaying the traffic stop with Derek in his mind. The way Hank had conducted the stop went against everything he had learned about fairness and respect. Jake wondered if this was just how things were done in the precinct, or if Hank's approach was an isolated case. He considered approaching Captain Davenport to discuss his concerns, but hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to come off as a naive rookie who couldn't handle the reality of the job. Yet, his conscience gnawed at him, reminding him that silence could make him complicit. One night, unable to sleep, he pulled out his father's old badge, running his thumb over the worn metal. "What would you do, Dad?" he thought, the weight of his father's legacy heavy on his heart. In the end, he resolved to keep a close watch on Hank's actions, hoping that it would be enough to make sense of his partner's methods. For now, he would stay quiet, but he wouldn't ignore his instincts. The next week, Jake found himself in Captain Davenport's office, ostensibly to discuss his progress as a rookie. But the conversation quickly turned to broader topics, with Davenport asking for Jake's take on how things were going. "Everything all right, Monroe?" Davenport asked, his gaze steady. "I know the first few weeks can be eye-opening." Jake hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's been good, sir. There's a lot to learn. But I guess I have a question about how we balance keeping control with treating people fairly." Davenport raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. That's the right question to ask, Officer Monroe. Policing is about finding that balance. We serve justice, not our own biases. If you ever feel that line is being crossed, you need to speak up. The captain's words resonated deeply with Jake, offering him a sense of support he hadn't realized he needed. He left the office more determined to follow his principles, knowing that Davenport's vision aligned with his own. Returning to his patrols, Jake felt a renewed commitment to his values. He began observing Hank more closely, noting the subtle ways his partner's methods seemed to prioritize control over respect. Each encounter with Hank's approach reinforced Jake's growing discomfort. One evening, as they responded to a call involving a group of teenagers gathered at a park after dark, Jake tried to take a gentler approach, talking to the teens rather than immediately interrogating them. Hank watched with a skeptical look, stepping in to question the group more harshly. Afterward, Jake dared to voice his thoughts. "Maybe we didn't need to be so hard on them, Sergeant." Hank gave him a withering look. "You think you know how to handle things better than I do, rookie? This isn't the academy, it's real life. Out here, control is what matters." Jake swallowed his frustration, sensing that arguing further wouldn't help. But the moment solidified his determination to do things differently. The precinct had become a second home to Jake. At least he had hoped it would. But as the weeks passed, he started noticing things he hadn't before. Small details that painted a picture of a department with deeply rooted issues. He overheard conversations between officers that hinted at casual prejudice, saw complaints from certain neighborhoods receive less urgency, and noticed how often Hank's version of a routine stop seemed to disproportionately target specific individuals. One evening, after a quiet patrol shift, Jake found himself alone in the locker room, thoughts swirling as he reflected on the differences between his ideals and the realities he was witnessing. Was he too idealistic, or was he just seeing the cracks in a system that needed repair? As he closed his locker, Captain Davenport's words echoed in his mind. "If you feel that line is being crossed, speak up." Jake had joined the force to make a difference, but the line between speaking up and staying silent felt narrower every day. It was a cloudy afternoon when Jake and Hank were cruising through downtown, Hank driving in comfortable silence while Jake scanned the streets. They were halfway through their shift when Hank's gaze locked on a familiar car, a sleek sedan driven by Derek Thompson. Hank's expression hardened, and without a word, he flicked on the siren and directed Jake to pull the car over. Jake's stomach churned with unease, but he stayed silent as they approached Derek's vehicle. Derek was visibly tense, but outwardly calm as he lowered his window. "Mr. Thompson?" Hank said, his voice hard. "Back in the neighborhood, I see." Jake watched Derek's shoulders tighten. "Yes, officer. Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" "Just a routine check," Hank replied, his tone sharp. "License and registration." Derek handed over his documents, his eyes meeting Jake's briefly with an expression that seemed to ask, "Are you okay with this?" Jake's face grew warm, and he struggled to keep his own discomfort hidden. Hank continued questioning Derek, asking about his job, his destination, and how he could afford his car. Every word heightened the tension in the air, and Jake found himself fighting an overwhelming urge to step in. Derek kept his answers polite but clipped, his face calm, but his eyes dark with frustration. When Hank finally waved him off, Jake felt a wave of relief as Derek drove away. But a deeper sense of guilt began to settle over him, one he couldn't shake. "Didn't you think that was a little unnecessary?" Jake asked, choosing his words carefully as they returned to the patrol car. Hank shot him a glare. "This is what we do, kid. You're too green to understand yet, but you will." Jake wanted to argue, to say that policing should be fair and consistent, but he bit his tongue. The doubt weighed on him as they drove back to the precinct, the incident with Derek a growing thorn in his conscience. That evening Jake lingered at the precinct, lost in thought. He sat at his desk, scribbling in his notebook, recording every detail of the day's patrol. The sounds of the precinct quieted as officers clocked out, leaving only a handful of people milling around. Just as he was about to pack up, Captain Davenport passed by. "Monroe, still here?" Davenport asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and nerves. Yes, sir? Just, wrapping up for the day. Davenport leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. How's it going out there? You adjusting to patrol life? Jake hesitated, then nodded. It's interesting. I'm learning a lot, but there are things I didn't expect. Davenport seemed to sense Jake's uncertainty and motioned him over. They walked down the empty hallway, and Davenport waited until they were out of earshot of the few remaining officers. I can tell something's bothering you, Davenport said quietly. If you're holding back, now's the time to let me know. Jake took a deep breath. It's just, sometimes it feels like we're not treating everyone the same. I mean, with certain stops, there's more to it than just enforcing the law. Davenport's expression softened, and he nodded. I know it's hard to see things that don't line up with what you expected. Part of the job is balancing that and figuring out how to make it better. Remember, you're not alone in this. If you see something that doesn't feel right, come to me. Jake nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. It wasn't a solution, but it was support. Something he needed now more than ever. A few days later, Jake and Hank responded to a disturbance call in a residential area. When they arrived, they found a young man in his 20s who had been sitting on the curb, his hands raised in a gesture of compliance. His name was Marcus, and he explained that he'd been out for a walk when someone reported him as a suspicious person. Hank approached Marcus with an aggressive tone, questioning him about his purpose in the area and searching his pockets without warning. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he watched, the aggressive approach striking him as overly harsh for a man who had been doing nothing wrong. Sir, I'm just walking home, Marcus said, his voice strained but calm. I haven't done anything wrong. Hank's voice grew colder. You got any ID on you? Let's see if your story checks out. Jake stepped forward, trying to soften the interaction. We're just doing our job, Marcus. Once we see your ID, we'll let you be on your way. The young man nodded, handing his ID to Jake. The brief interaction passed without incident, but as they walked back to the car, Jake's frustration bubbled over. Do we really have to come down on people so hard, Hank? Jake asked, his voice barely containing his irritation. Hank shrugged. Kid, if you don't keep people in check, you lose control. Control is everything in this job. As they drove away, Jake sat in silence, his mind spinning with doubts. He began to wonder if he could ever fit into a system that seemed to prioritize fear over trust. That night, Jake couldn't shake the discomfort he felt from the encounter with Marcus. He called his sister, Emma, who had always been his confidant. She was an elementary school teacher, and her gentle, compassionate outlook balanced Jake's intense personality. After a few minutes of small talk, Emma picked up on his mood. Something's up, isn't it? I can hear it in your voice. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, I guess. It's just, this job isn't exactly what I expected. There are things that feel off, you know. Emma was silent for a moment, and Jake imagined her brow furrowing as she chose her words carefully. Jake, I know you became a cop to make a difference. Don't lose sight of that just because things don't look like you thought they would. If something doesn't feel right, maybe it's a sign to trust your instincts. Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after their conversation ended. Jake realized that he was at a crossroads. He could either let the system change him, or he could try, in his own way, to change the system. The next time Jake and Hank encountered Derek, the stop escalated in a way that shocked Jake. They were driving through the downtown area when Hank spotted Derek's car again. Jake's pulse quickened as he saw Hank's expression harden. "Pull him over," Hank ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Derek complied, his face calm, but his eyes wary as they approached. Hank immediately started questioning him, his tone more aggressive than before. Jake watched, trying to gauge how to intervene without setting off his partner. When Derek challenged Hank, saying he'd done nothing wrong, Jake saw Hank's demeanor shift from irritation to something more intense. Without warning, Hank opened Derek's car door, instructing him to step out. As Derek stood by the side of the road, Hank's questions became invasive, each one feeling like an escalation. Jake could see Derek's patience slipping, his frustration building. "Why are you stopping me again?" Derek asked, his voice edged with anger. "I haven't done anything wrong, and this is the third time you've pulled me over." Hank's response was cold. People who have nothing to hide don't have a problem with a routine check. Derek's expression turned from frustration to anger. He looked directly at Jake, and for a brief moment, Jake felt the weight of Derek's unspoken question. "Will you let this happen?" Jake's voice came out more firmly than he expected. "Sergeant, I think he's telling the truth. Maybe we can let this one go." Hank glared at him. "You think you know better than me, rookie? Don't forget your place." The stop ended without incident, but Jake felt like he had crossed an invisible line. He knew he couldn't keep watching silently as Hank's methods went unchecked. The decision weighed heavily on him, filling him with a sense of inevitability. That night, Jake sat alone in his apartment, wrestling with his thoughts. The stops, the profiling, the sense of injustice. It was too much to ignore. He pulled out his phone, hovering over Captain Davenport's number. His hand shook, but he took a steadying breath, recalling Emma's words and his father's legacy. Finally, he hit call, the ringing feeling like the start of something irreversible. "Captain Davenport here." "It's Jake Monroe, sir," Jake said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I need to talk to you about Sergeant Barrett's actions on patrol. I think they're crossing a line." Davenport was silent for a moment before replying, his tone serious. "Come to my office tomorrow, Officer Monroe. Let's talk." As Jake hung up, he felt both terrified and relieved. He didn't know what the consequences would be, but he knew he had to make a stand. For Derek, for his father, and for himself. The next morning, Jake walked into Captain Davenport's office with a pounding heart. He knew the risks, but the sense of relief he'd felt after finally deciding to speak up had been overwhelming. As he sat down, Davenport closed the door and gave Jake a steady, encouraging look. "Tell me everything, Officer Monroe," Davenport said, his voice calm yet firm. Jake took a deep breath and recounted the incidents with Hank, the repeated stops with Derek, the profiling, and Hank's aggressive behavior with Marcus. He hesitated when mentioning Derek's last stop, feeling a pang of guilt for not intervening sooner. When he finished, Davenport sat back, his expression thoughtful. "This is serious, Jake. What you're describing goes beyond poor judgment. It's misconduct." Jake nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know, sir, but I didn't want to ignore it." "I couldn't." Davenport regarded him with respect. "I'll open a formal investigation. Be prepared. This will have consequences for both you and Sergeant Barrett. Stay strong and know you're doing the right thing." As Jake left the office, a mixture of apprehension and satisfaction filled him. The wheels were in motion, and there was no going back now. News of the investigation spread quickly through the precinct, sparking gossip and suspicion. Jake could feel eyes on him as he walked through the halls, whispers following him like shadows. Officers he once thought of as potential friends kept their distance, some offering cold glances that made his stomach turn. The hostility was even more palpable in the locker room, where he found himself alone as others avoided him. One afternoon he found a note taped to his locker. "Keep quiet, rookie. Nobody likes a snitch." Jake's pulse quickened as he tore the note down, anger simmering beneath his skin. He tried to shake it off, but the words haunted him. The growing isolation gnawed at his confidence, making each day feel heavier. As he prepared to head home, Captain Davenport passed by, giving Jake a subtle nod. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Jake that he wasn't completely alone. It was only a matter of time before Jake and Hank clashed directly. Hank cornered Jake one evening in the parking lot, his face twisted in anger. "You went to Davenport, didn't you?" Hank growled, stepping closer until he was only inches away from Jake. Jake stood his ground, feeling his heart hammer but refusing to back down. "I did what I had to do, Hank. What you've been doing isn't right." Hank's gaze burned with fury, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a kid who doesn't understand how this job works. You crossed a line, Monroe. You'll regret it." The words stung, but Jake held his ground. "Maybe I don't know everything, but I know enough to recognize when someone's going too far. This isn't about me, Hank. It's about doing what's right." Hank sneered. "Right? You don't know the first thing about right and wrong out here, but you'll learn, one way or another." As Hank stalked off, Jake felt both relief and a new surge of determination. He knew the road ahead would be rough, but he was more certain than ever that he had made the right choice. Davenport wasted no time in launching the investigation. Jake was called in repeatedly, recounting his experiences and providing detailed statements about the incidents he had witnessed. Each time he spoke, he felt the weight of his words, understanding that they could determine the outcome of Hank's career, and, by extension, his own. Other officers were called in to give their accounts, and Jake quickly noticed the divide within the precinct. Some officers supported Hank, seeing him as a seasoned cop who knew how to handle the streets. Others, though more quietly, expressed support for Jake's integrity. Jake's isolation grew, and he found solace only in the occasional words of encouragement from Davenport and the few officers who believed in what he was doing. The pressure mounted, and he began to feel the strain on his mind and spirit. Jake's sister, Emma, noticed the change in his demeanor during one of their regular calls. She could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the tension that laced his words. "You're doing the right thing, Jake," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "I know it's hard, but you're standing up for people who need it. Just remember that you're not alone." Her words brought a wave of relief, and Jake thanked her for her unwavering support. Knowing that his family stood behind him gave him the strength he needed to face the pressures at work. He clung to the knowledge that he was fighting for something bigger than himself. One afternoon, Jake received an unexpected message from Derek Thompson, requesting a meeting. Curious and slightly anxious, Jake agreed, meeting Derek at a local coffee shop. Derek looked more composed than he had during their encounters on patrol, but his eyes held a steely determination. "Officer Monroe, I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice calm but intense. "I know this can't be easy for you." Jake felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I'm sorry it took so long for me to step up, Derek. You deserved better from us." Derek gave a small, understanding nod. "I appreciate your honesty. But it's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated unfairly. If you keep fighting, maybe things can start to change." Jake felt a surge of resolve, bolstered by Derek's words. He left the meeting more determined than ever to see the investigation through, knowing that he was part of something bigger than himself. The investigation concluded a few days later, and the precinct made the decision to suspend Hank, pending further review. The announcement sent shockwaves through the department, sparking a mixture of reactions among the officers. Some reacted with anger, seeing Hank's suspension as an attack on their way of policing, while others expressed quiet relief, hopeful that it marked the beginning of a new standard of integrity. Captain Davenport called Jake into his office after the decision was made. "You did well, Monroe," he said, his tone filled with quiet pride. "This wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Jake nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Hank's suspension marked a victory for justice, but it came at a heavy price. As he left Davenport's office, he noticed the wary gazes of his fellow officers, each one a reminder of the divide his actions had created. He knew he'd face more challenges, but he also understood that he had taken the first crucial step toward change. The news of Hank's suspension reached the community, sparking a wave of support for Jake. Local activists praised his courage, and residents who had felt marginalized by the department began to view him as an ally. A small group of community members organized a vigil outside the precinct, holding candles and signs that read, "Justice and Integrity." Jake watched from a distance, humbled by their show of support. Captain Davenport joined him, watching the vigil with a thoughtful expression. "This is what you've done, Monroe. You've given people hope." Jake felt a swell of pride, but he knew that the journey was far from over. This was only the beginning of a long and difficult road to rebuilding trust within the community. Within the precinct, Hank's suspension intensified the divide. Officers who had once respected Jake now regarded him with suspicion or outright hostility. The tension was so thick it was almost tangible, with conversations halting when Jake entered a room and officers openly avoiding him. One day, as he prepared for his shift, A group of officers confronted him, their expressions hard. "You've put a target on our backs, Monroe," one officer said, his tone accusing. "People like you make this job harder for all of us." Jake held his ground, his voice steady but tense. "This isn't about making things harder. It's about doing what's right. I'm here to serve everyone in our community, not just some." The officers exchanged dark looks, and Jake felt a chill run through him. But he refused to back down, knowing that he had made a choice to stand for justice, even if it meant facing hostility from his peers. As public support for Jake's actions grew, a rally was organized outside the precinct. Community members shared their experiences, many expressing hope that the department would embrace a more just approach. Activists, local leaders, and residents voiced their appreciation for the integrity Jake had shown, calling for accountability and systemic change. Captain Davenport invited Jake to speak at the rally. Standing before the crowd, Jake felt a mixture of nerves and pride as he addressed them. "I took an oath to serve and protect everyone in this community," he said, his voice steady. "It's a responsibility I don't take lightly. I believe in a future where every person, no matter their background, can trust the police to treat them with fairness and respect. That's the kind of department I'm committed to helping build." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jake felt a powerful sense of purpose wash over him. This was what he had been fighting for, a chance to bring integrity and justice to his role as an officer. As days passed following Hank's suspension, the precinct grew colder toward Jake. Officers who had once nodded in greeting now turned their backs, and he was left alone in the locker room more often than not. Even casual conversations died down when he entered a room. It was as if he'd become invisible, or worse, unwelcome. The isolation weighed heavily on Jake, and each day felt like a test of endurance. He hadn't expected support, but the hostility he faced left him drained and questioning his resolve. One evening, as he opened his locker, a crumpled note fell out. "Rats don't last long in this line of work." Jake's stomach twisted as he read the words, the veiled threat making his blood run cold. He crumpled the note in his fist, feeling anger mixed with fear, but he refused to let it break him. News of the investigation into Hank's actions and Jake's role in reporting them had spread throughout the community, drawing reactions from those who felt unheard for too long. A few days after Hank's suspension, a group of community leaders organized a small event outside the precinct, gathering people to show solidarity with Jake's stand for integrity. Jake watched from a window inside the precinct as people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for All" and "Stand with Officer Monroe." The sight filled him with a strange sense of relief and a reminder that he wasn't alone. Later that evening, Davenport pulled him aside. "You've given people hope, Monroe," Davenport said, his voice carrying a tone of pride. "What you're doing matters. Remember that, especially when things get tough." Jake nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The community's support reinforced his commitment, and he knew he couldn't let them down. Jake's sister, Emma, was one of the few people he could rely on to ground him. They met for coffee on a rare day off, and as soon as Emma saw him, she wrapped him in a warm hug. "You look exhausted," she said, concern etched in her eyes as they sat down. "How's everything going?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's rough, Em. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, going against everyone like this." Emma's face softened. "You did what was right, Jake. Not what was easy, but what was right. Dad would be proud of you." Her words struck a chord, and Jake felt a surge of emotion. His father's legacy, the values he'd instilled, reminded Jake why he had joined the force in the first place. He squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering support. "You're right," he said, his resolve strengthening. "I needed to hear that." One afternoon, as Jake prepared to head out for his shift, Officer Tom Walker, a longtime friend of Hank's, confronted him in the hallway. Walker's expression was hard, and he blocked Jake's path with a look of contempt. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, Monroe?" Walker sneered, his voice low and filled with anger. "You're just a naive rookie who doesn't understand how things work." Jake's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. I did what was necessary. What Hank was doing wasn't right, and you know it." Walker's face twisted with rage. "You put a target on all of our backs. The streets aren't safe, and now, thanks to you, none of us can do our jobs without looking over our shoulders." "Doing our jobs means respecting the people we're supposed to protect," Jake replied firmly. "If you can't see that, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Walker scoffed, stepping back with a disgusted look. "You'll learn soon enough, Monroe. This job isn't as simple as you think." As he walked away, Jake felt a mixture of frustration and disappointment. The confrontation left him more determined, but also reminded him of the divide within the department, a divide he was determined to bridge. That night, Jake lay awake, staring at the ceiling as doubts crept into his mind. The strain of the past few weeks weighed on him, and he wondered if he was fighting a losing battle. Was he naive to think he could make a difference, or was he simply too idealistic? As he lay there, he thought of his father, remembering his words about integrity. "In this job, you'll face choices that test you to your core. Choose what's right, not what's easy." The memory reignited a spark within him, a reminder of why he'd taken this path in the first place. He sat up, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't in this fight alone. He had the support of Davenport, Emma, and the community. And that was enough. One morning, as Jake prepared for a briefing, Officer Amy Green, a fellow rookie, approached him. She'd been one of the few officers who hadn't outright ignored him since Hank's suspension. "Hey, Monroe," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I just wanted to say, I respect what you did. It couldn't have been easy." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, surprised by her words. "Thank you, Amy. It's been rough, but I appreciate that." Amy nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're setting an example. I've seen things too, things that don't sit right. Watching you, it makes me want to do better." Her words reminded Jake that his actions had an impact, even on those who hadn't openly shown support. Knowing he'd inspired others gave him strength, and he felt a new sense of purpose as he headed out for his shift. Captain Davenport encouraged Jake to participate in a community meeting at a local center, where residents gathered to voice their concerns and share their experiences with law enforcement. As Jake listened, he was struck by the raw honesty of their stories, each one a testament to the strained relationship between the community and the police. When it was his turn to speak, Jake felt nervous but resolute. "I know trust has been broken, and I can't change the past. But I'm here to listen, to understand, and to do better. This uniform should represent safety and respect, and that's what I'm committed to." The room was silent for a moment, then a woman in the back stood up, clapping slowly. The applause grew, and Jake felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. These were the people he served, and he was determined to earn their trust. Jake's commitment to reform didn't go unnoticed, and some of Hank's supporters weren't pleased. One evening, as Jake was leaving the precinct, he discovered that his car had been vandalized. The windows were shattered, and "Traitor" was scrawled across the hood in red spray paint. The sight left him momentarily shaken, but he quickly steadied himself. The act was meant to intimidate him, to break his resolve, but Jake refused to let fear control him. Captain Davenport met with him the following morning, inspecting the damage with a grim expression. "This isn't acceptable. We'll find out who did this, and they'll face consequences." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down, sir. This just makes me more determined." Davenport's expression softened. "Good. The department needs people like you." Word of the vandalism spread, drawing attention from the media and amplifying public support for Jake. Community members organized another rally, standing outside the precinct with signs calling for accountability and praising Jake's courage. During a news interview, Jake spoke about the importance of reform, emphasizing his commitment to integrity and fairness. "This is about building a future where everyone feels safe and respected. I believe in that future, and I know we can make it happen." The interview went viral, garnering support from people who had experienced similar injustices. Jake's words resonated, and he began receiving letters and messages from people across the city, thanking him for his bravery. The precinct's atmosphere slowly began to shift as Davenport's reforms took root. Mandatory bias training sessions were implemented, and Davenport organized regular meetings with community leaders, emphasizing transparency and open dialogue. Jake noticed subtle changes in his fellow officers. Some began nodding in acknowledgement when they passed him in the halls, while others even offered a few words of encouragement. Officer Green, who had become a quiet ally, expressed interest in leading community outreach initiatives, inspired by Jake's example. The divide wasn't gone, but Jake could see progress. His actions had planted seeds of change, and he felt a renewed sense of hope. Davenport officially rolled out new policies, including body cameras, community liaisons, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. The department's transformation wasn't immediate, but the changes marked a step toward a better future. Jake found himself involved in training sessions, sharing his experiences, and encouraging other officers to prioritize integrity. The work was challenging, but seeing the impact he was having made every struggle worthwhile. Over time, the precinct became a place where officers held each other accountable, where conversations about fairness and justice weren't dismissed, but encouraged. Jake knew there was still a long way to go, but he was proud to be part of a department moving in the right direction. One evening, Jake attended a neighborhood event with Davenport and a few other officers. As he mingled with residents, he felt the warmth of their appreciation and the cautious hope in their voices. Derek Thompson approached him, extending a hand. "Thank you, Jake. For everything?" Jake shook his hand, a smile breaking across his face. "I did what I had to, Derek, and I'll keep doing it." They stood together, watching as children played and neighbors shared stories, a small but powerful symbol of the future they were working toward. Jake felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that his actions had made a difference. Jake's stomach churned as he entered the courthouse. The case against Hank Barrett was now in the public eye, with news cameras, activists, and community members gathered outside, buzzing with anticipation. Jake tried to tune out the murmurs, focusing instead on the importance of his testimony. This was the moment that would determine the future for both Hank and the precinct. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Hank sat at the defense table, his face hardened, a shell of the confident man Jake had once known. The prosecutor opened with a powerful statement about justice and integrity, setting the stage for a trial that would reveal both Hank's actions and the systemic issues that had gone unchecked. As Jake waited to testify, he felt a strange mix of nerves and resolve. He knew that his words could make or break the case, and he was prepared to face the repercussions, knowing that truth was on his side. When Jake was called to the stand, he took a steadying breath and looked out at the room, filled with both supportive and skeptical faces. He felt the weight of each gaze, knowing that this was his moment to speak for everyone who had been affected by misconduct. The prosecutor asked Jake to recount his experiences with Hank, focusing on specific incidents where Hank's behavior had crossed the line. Jake spoke about Derek's repeated stops, the profiling, and the aggressive interrogation of Marcus. Each detail a reminder of why he'd chosen to report Hank in the first place. "Why did you come forward?" the prosecutor asked, her voice soft but probing. Jake's gaze didn't waver. "I took an oath to protect and serve everyone, not just some." I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. It went against everything I believe in. The courtroom was silent as he finished speaking, his words hanging in the air. He felt a wave of relief, knowing he'd done everything he could to stand for justice. The defense attorney argued that Hank had been operating under the pressures of the job, his actions driven by a desire to keep the community safe. Hank took the stand, painting himself as a cop hardened by years of difficult cases, forced to make tough choices for the sake of public safety. Hank looked directly at Jake as he spoke, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I did what I had to do, and you, Monroe, you think you know better? You don't understand the streets like I do. You're just a rookie playing hero." Jake met Hank's gaze, his heart heavy but resolute. Being a cop doesn't mean bending the rules to suit our own beliefs. It means following the law and treating people with respect. That's what real service looks like. Hank's expression faltered for a moment, his confidence wavering as the courtroom absorbed Jake's words. Jake felt a surge of strength. realizing that this confrontation was more than just a battle between him and Hank. It was a testament to the values he'd fought to uphold. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed with spectators, each one waiting in hushed anticipation. Jake sat beside Captain Davenport, his nerves frayed as the judge read out the decision. Guilty on all counts. A murmur rippled through the room as Hank's face drained of color, his bravado stripped away. The judge announced his sentence, a term that underscored the severity of his actions and the department's commitment to accountability. As Hank was led out of the courtroom, Jake felt a mixture of relief and sadness. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it was a step toward justice, a step toward rebuilding the integrity of the badge he wore. The trial had ended, but he knew that the real work was only beginning. In the days following the trial, Davenport held another precinct-wide meeting, using Hank's case as a reminder of the importance of integrity and fairness. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "We're here to serve this community, and that means holding ourselves to a higher standard," Davenport said, his voice resonating through the room. "Officer Monroe's actions have shown us that real change starts from within. We will continue to hold ourselves accountable, to be worthy of the trust placed in us." The room was silent, but Jake felt the weight of Davenport's words. The department had been given a second chance to redefine itself, and he knew they had a long road ahead. But with Davenport's leadership and the new policies in place, he was hopeful. A few weeks after the trial, Jake attended a community meeting hosted by Derek and other local leaders. The room was filled with residents, young and old, each one with their own story of hardship and resilience. Jake felt a sense of humility as he listened, reminded of the importance of the community he served. When it was his turn to speak, Jake addressed the room with sincerity. "I know that trust has been broken, and I know we have a lot of work to do. But I promise you that I am committed to rebuilding that trust, to serving you with honesty and respect." Derek approached him afterward, offering a handshake and a nod of respect. "Thank you, Jake. What you did took courage. You've given us hope." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, knowing that his journey had brought him closer to the community he'd vowed to protect. This connection was the foundation of everything he'd fought for, and he was determined to honor it. With Davenport's reforms in place, the precinct began to change. Officers underwent mandatory bias and de-escalation training, body cameras became standard equipment, and a community liaison program was established. Jake noticed a shift in his colleagues, a willingness to engage more respectfully with residents. Officer Amy Green, who had supported Jake through the investigation, joined him in leading community outreach efforts, building bridges between the precinct and the neighborhoods they served. Jake saw the impact of their work in small but meaningful interactions, a nod here, a smile there, small signs of trust rebuilding. Though the journey had been painful, Jake felt pride in seeing his actions bear fruit. The precinct was evolving, becoming a place where integrity and accountability were valued. He knew there would still be challenges, but the steps they were taking were a foundation for real change. One evening, Davenport invited Jake to his office for a private conversation. As they sat down, Davenport regarded him with a look of quiet respect. "You've done more than just report misconduct, Monroe. You've set a standard for this department," Davenport said. "It's rare to find someone willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Jake felt a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done it without your support." Davenport nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm recommending you for a leadership role in our new community outreach program. You've shown that you have the character and dedication to make a real difference. If you're willing, I'd like you to help lead this new initiative." Jake felt a surge of gratitude. "I'd be honored, sir." As he left Davenport's office, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey had brought him to this moment, a chance to help shape the future of the department from within. Months later, the precinct held a community event to celebrate the progress they'd made. Families gathered, children played, and officers mingled with residents, each interaction a small step toward healing. Jake saw familiar faces in the crowd, people he had met along the way: Derek, Emma, Officer Green, and Davenport. Each one a testament to the support that had sustained him. Jake took a moment to speak to the crowd, his voice filled with quiet conviction. We're here today because change is possible. Because integrity, justice, and trust are worth fighting for. This isn't the end of our journey, but a new beginning. I'm proud to serve this community, and I'm committed to making sure every person here feels safe and respected. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle, from a rookie filled with ideals to a leader who had proven the strength of his convictions. The challenges he'd faced had forged him into the officer he was always meant to be. As time passed, the precinct's reforms began to show results. Complaints of misconduct dropped, and community trust slowly returned. Jake continued to lead outreach programs, building relationships, and ensuring the precinct upheld its commitment to fairness. One evening, he attended a graduation ceremony for the police academy, where he was invited to speak. Standing before the new recruits, he saw reflections of his younger self in their faces, each one filled with hope and purpose. Being an officer means choosing integrity every day, even when it's hard, he told them. You'll face difficult decisions, but remember that your duty is to serve with honor. Stand up for what's right, and you'll make a difference. As the ceremony ended, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his place, not only as an officer, but as a protector of the values that defined his community. The road had been long and difficult, but he was proud of the legacy he was building, a legacy of integrity, justice, and hope. Thank you for joining Jake's journey, a story of resilience, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. If you enjoyed this story and want more inspiring narratives that dive deep into the challenges and triumphs of everyday heroes, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to life. Join us as we continue to explore tales that inspire change, hope, and the strength within us all. Subscribe now and be part of our community of storytellers.